Thank you very much for giving us some insight into what's in the report. Thank you very much. So we've got time for some questions comments from the audience. So there's a hand up the back, right at the back. Zuza?
Just building on that last point you made, Harry, if we let the market decide, what role do the tobacco industry play, do you think, in shifting the dial or swinging the pendulum a bit further?
And I think this very much relies on the control and the regulatory environment, because no company is going to invest in a situation where the government of whatever country it happens to be is making life extremely difficult, if not impossible. I mean, I find it incredible, even in this country, that a tobacco company cannot put an advert, a little note inside one of its own packets to suggest to people, to smokers, that they might switch away from the cigarette they're just about to pull out of the packet. So there's when I say governments can get out the way, I think that yes, they need to get out the way, but they need to create the regulatory environment for everything else to follow. Because if they do that, then there's more chance of investment. The UK, for example, does not have to follow the EU TPD, to the best of my knowledge. It chooses to, but it doesn't have to. So we could have snus in this country as well. So I think there's a kind of, say, domino effect, I suppose. But if the regime is more liberal, is more relaxed, is more proportionate, you're likely to encourage more investment. And if you get more investment and there are more products available, then, the consumers will come, I think, would be my answer to that.
Okay, Zuza, there's a question here. Wait for mic because it's recorded.
Okay, hi. I mean, it's really striking that I mean, people say, is tobacco harm reduction working? And in one way, you could say, yes, it is, because, millions of people are using it to protect their own health at their own expense and their own initiative. But then you look at the regulators and the legislative environment, it's all heading in the opposite direction. Isn't what's really happening, all these mighty organizations like FDA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, now the British government, aren't they basically just turning the market from legal to illegal? In Mexico, in Brazil, in India, isn't the main effect now of the tobacco control and WHO interventions in these marketplaces not to stop these products, but just to change how they're supplied? And isn't the task on our side of the argument now to master the sort of nature of illicit trade and all the harms that it brings with it, and make the arguments from that perspective? That's a suggestion for the next report.
Right, I'll come back to you on that one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think to be honest, we define different versions of illegal in the report. I mean, there is illegal in terms of products that are just downright dangerous. They've got dodgy batteries and they leak metals and they do all of this kind of crap. And of course, there are illegal products that are illegal simply because the country doesn't allow them in, or they're smuggled in and they're sold more cheaply because they avoid excise tax. And we have that in this country. I mean, our border force sees thousands of these products, and that's in a country where the control regime is relatively proportionate. I mean, you can buy, apart from snus, you can buy pretty much everything, I think, in this country. So I think if you bear in mind the world is awash with illegal products, dodgy Rolex watches, perfume, fashion accessories. I have heard of fake heated tobacco products as well. It's probably impossible to stop. I always feel that this I mean, people ask. I've had this question from Brent Stafford when I did the interview for GNTV recently. Isn't there a disconnect between the way the product and the consumers are going and the way policy responds? And I do feel that most of, well, two things are going on. You've got a control regime that's hiding, that they're fronting this moral objection. They're fronting a moral objection to the use of nicotine. They don't want people to use nicotine. It doesn't matter whether it's legal, illegal, in a cigarette, in a vape, they don't want it. So they're making a moral judgment, in a sense, weaponizing public health to make this moral judgment. And also, there's this huge legacy from the tobacco industry. There's the fact that these products, and it's ironic really, because I think there's plenty of evidence to show that if you might call big tobacco, however you want to define that, have got less than 30% of the global vaping market. Most of this is happening in the Far East. So they don't even have a major market share in these products. But all the media attention is focused on them because of their egregious history that goes back and that we're all familiar with. But in a way, trying to make the argument on the basis of illegality and what happens, it ain't worked in the drug world. There's lots of, and Adrian knows this better than anyone. We know about all the contaminants that are in drugs. We know the massive profits made by drug cartels, and you can talk about, you know, the dangers of having an illicit market in drugs until you're blue in the face. It doesn't seem to make a huge amount of difference on the policy front, unless, I mean, marijuana, I suppose, is now in America and certain other places, they've kind of come round to the idea that society will not fall on its knees if people are smoking cannabis. But the arguments are not being won. However many people die, however many drug deaths go through the roof. I mean, in the UK, Scotland's got some of the highest drug-related death rates in Europe. They're making a difference. They've got a red line. They've got making moral judgments, and they're doing exactly the same in the world of tobacco harm reduction. Like I say, adult smokers, you know, we're still in the quit or die. We're still in the quit or die narrative. Very long-winded answer, but
Giorgi.
May I also add to the narrative of Harry? So from the data perspective, there is quite limited research also in this regard. So there's numerous studies about illegal combustibles around the world. But about illegal sales of safer nicotine products, their scale compared to they share in the total market. If you carefully read our report, chapter 4, you will see that there is a subchapter about illicit markets, and it's quite small. It's about half of the page, because we just can't see any data analysis on this topic. So except what we see on the streets, on the market, and we can't analyze the numbers on this. So this is also good idea for the future research in this area.
There's a difficult thing that I can't understand. We all know the argument about prohibition leads to illegal markets, but even with respect to vaping products, even where you've got legal regulated markets, you've got an influx of non-regulated goods. I'm trying to get my head around what is going on here from a kind of consumer point of view. I suppose it's, if you want to buy you can get your Gucci t-shirt if you want to go to Bond Street, or you can get your Gucci t-shirt from the Woolworth Road Market at very different price. It's something interesting going on in the dynamics here about consumption that isn't simply prohibition leads to irregular markets, because irregular markets are cropping up in jurisdictions where you have legal products.
Jerry, if I could give you one example, there's a lot of there's a lot of illicit trade in disposables, but there's a piece of idiotic regulation that sits behind that, which is the limit on tank size of 2 milliliter. In the United States and North America now, the average tank size is sort of 10 to 15 milliliters. So that reflects where the market is going when it's unconstrained. It's constrained in the UK and the European Union. So those products that meet the customer's need don't get through the MHRA or the European equivalents, and therefore they're just shipped. So my take is that the regulator should stop trying to get between what the adult consumer wants and the products, because that's what they're doing, and that's what leads to illicit trade in that case, or insane workarounds with sort of filler bottles strapped to the side of the product and that kind of thing.
So it's kind of regulatory prohibition. You know, your car's capped at 30
It's a
mile an hour
prohibition of the
rather
thing you want,
Yeah.
whether it's a flavour,
Yes.
a large tank size, a big puff device. And I'm sure that if we had an approach that says adults must get the products they want supplied legally, that would deal with a lot of the illicit trade.
Okay. Next question. Sud here, and then there's a question at the back there.
Hi, Sud Patwadan. First of all, congratulations to KAC and the team for a 4th edition. It's not easy to kind of persevere with something like this. A comment on the content. I note that, and of course, it's logical for you guys to focus on the global smoking epidemic. But I am going to plug in this need for also addressing, which you do in the report, by the way. I've had a very quick scan, and 3 or 4 times you mentioned the world of smokeless tobacco, 300 million people consuming it. Now, 300 is not a small number. They are in LMICs who use risky forms of oral tobacco. Would you be open to considering in the next edition at least a section like the ones you have for other countries on risky smokeless tobacco? And let me just give a reason why you may want to do that, is because a lot of nicotine misperceptions potentially come from the fact that oral tobacco products in LMICs cause harm, and medical professionals, policymakers do not necessarily sit down and think what may be the reason the harm is. And oftentimes they attribute it to nicotine. And now with the advent, and as we can see with the US data for pouches may be the future given the clean nature of consumption and oral consumption. Smokeless tobacco, and not understanding and acknowledging the harms and differentiating what's causing it may also be the downfall of even pouches and harm reduction globally. So would you be open to that? And if so, happy to help, of course.
I think Giorgi.
Yeah, sure. Also, I want to add that we slightly discuss this topic in the subchapter on Central Asia, Eastern Europe and Central Asia, because in 3 countries of Central Asia, which is Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kazakhstan, there is kind of harmful smokeless tobacco product, as Harry mentioned, specific to this region, Naswai. And it is interesting there, for example, in Kazakhstan, because of Naswai and the health harms, they banned all types of oral products. So snus, nicotine pouches, Naswai is banned. But interestingly, in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, where there is a huge population, this is cottage business, so they are doing it in small businesses, in small households. They ban everything except Naswai. So nicotine pouches and snus are banned, but Naswai, because it's traditional product which brings a lot of income to population, so it's political question. And as for the openness in the to discuss these products, and I believe you mean the South Asia, for example, huge population affected. So of course it will be important, and we definitely can discuss it in more detail in the next report.
Yeah, and of course, South Asian tobaccos are available in the UK. You know, they were exempt because they were chewed rather than sucked. It was the you know, trying to legislate snus out of existence, but not taking too much notice of South Asian tobacco. So you can go to a corner shop, you can buy loose tobacco, and you can buy slate lime, and you know, everything to put it together. There's a question at the back. I think it's Barnaby. Is it?
Thank you, Barnaby Page, Tamarind Intelligence. I did not so much a question really. I just wanted to briefly comment on a couple of things that Harry and Clive said. We've been doing quite a lot of work on illicit recently, and I would very much echo Harry's point. It's extremely difficult to measure the size of the illicit market, except to say that it exists everywhere. But I think sort of to amplify what Clive said as well, it's really worth remembering that illicit, though there are rip-off products, there are stolen products and so on. Illicit is mostly a function of the regime. It's not a function of the product. And the biggest example we see here is in the United States, where the vast majority of e-cigarettes sold, even sold above board by legitimate retailers, are technically illicit product because they haven't received PMTA approval. Now, if the United States switched tomorrow to an EU-style regime, they would suddenly become licit product without even having to be put on different shelves. So it's completely down to the regulatory regime there. It's not about the products. They're not separate things.
In one of my more mischievous moments, I kind of think that if the WHO and the FCTC have their way and everyone bans everything, they can hand the whole thing over to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and let them deal with it so that they don't have to. But yes, you're absolutely right. It is a product of regulation and control, and again, I think this it keeps coming back, and we've said it before. I'm convinced that a lot of this is the think about the kids narrative. It does seem to fall into that category more and more. But I think again, to some extent, I mean the concerns are valid. I mean politicians, parents, and so on. I mean they've got valid concerns about this, and you can't completely rubbish this, but I do think that young people, in a way, are being kind of, I've used the word weaponized before, and I think they're the human shield, I think, between the products and the regulators, and the people who suffer in the end are just going to be the people you actually don't want to be suffering. You want the people to be convinced with proper information and proper access that if you're a current adult smoker, it really is a good idea, to try these products, create the environment in which you can at least try it. It might not work, you might hate it, you might go back to smoking, but at least give people the option. And as we've seen from our own data work, there are relatively few countries where you have access to all the available products. I think the number was 27 out of 195. Because from what I know, and I think Mark made the point as well, people who are using the product are not just using one product. They may have an array of products that they want to use. Some places you might want to be using nicotine more discreetly because you're not allowed to vape, maybe inside a pub or in public transport or something like that. So why not? Why not give people a whole palette of options? But they just don't.
Charlie.
If Stanton Glantz was here today, what do you think his comments would be in response to this report? And a second link to it is, what are the highlights of 2 years worth? And for me, I saw the Lithuania smokers are now in a minority relative to SMP users.
Harry, I think you can have a go at the first part of that. I'm not going
to address the second part of that. The first part of that is I should think Stanton Glantz would get pinned up against the wall by a very large number of people in this room and pummeled. But for those you don't know, Stanton Glantz is an alleged expert from, I think he was an aerospace engineer to start off with, so I'm not quite sure where his expertise comes in this world. But anyway, he set himself up as the sort of poster boy of anti-tobacco harm reduction. Writes papers, some of which get ultimately not redacted, that's the wrong word. Retracted, that's the word, retracted, because people like Clive are often able to point out the methodology is complete and utter crap, I think one classic example is when he tried to suggest that vapes called heart attack, and it turned out that the study group had already had heart attacks even before they took up vaping. So this is the kind of thing that was going on. So I don't think I'd be very brave for him to turn up. And in fact, it's worth saying that at Global Forum of Nicotine, I think there have been open invitations to people to come and join the debate. Come and join the debate in a safe environment, and they just won't come. They talk about Article 5.3 because there might be somebody from PMI in the audience, and we can't. We might get. But the tobacco virus might attack us in the room. I mean, the whole thing is complete nonsense. But he'd get a fair hearing. We'd sit him here and we'd question him and say, you'd ask him questions and he would answer in his own inimitable fashion.
There's a question here in a minute from Martin. But Charlie, what was the other difficult question you asked? No,
Oh, yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, I can answer that. He would just shake his head and say, it's fake news.
quick one.
You're manipulating the figures. It doesn't compute. And he'd have lots of so-called medical and public health people, WHO and others, who would also dispute all the figures and say it's all desperate and awful. So I can't see any Malcolm Gladwell tipping point for someone like that to change their mind, because this groupthink, there's a whole groupthink thing going on about this, and they're not likely to change their minds. The only hope really is that there's enough of a voice that can persuade regulators and legislators to change their minds and not try not to get all this poison drip fed into their ears about tobacco harm reduction.
Clive wants to comment on the same topic, and Rebecca, then Martin, if you wait.
I don't think you should understate the persuasiveness of the argument from the other side in this. I mean, more or less I can't speak for him directly, but more or less what I think Professor Glantz would say is cigarette smoking worldwide is trending downwards. We're on the cusp of an epic victory through the forceful application of traditional tobacco control measures. The tobacco industry has come back off the ropes with a new strategy to, if you like, infect the world's young people with nicotine, and its tobacco harm reduction strategy is a survival strategy for itself at the expense of young people who will then become addicted, age into the population as permanent users. Okay. All the charts that we saw earlier, they all started and already had a downward trend in them. So any progress that's been made with safer nicotine products has to be incremental, in their view, on what was already happening. Why I think he's wrong and why I think we are weak on countering that argument is that we haven't been able to properly articulate why there is a demand for nicotine. It's sort of seen as something that is just comes from somewhere. We can't really, in the public health side, explain why people like it, use it, stick with it, other than through a fairly sort of banal argument about addiction. In that people just use it because they took it up when they were young and they tried it and they got addicted. That is insufficient to deal with the arguments of Professor Glantz and the more articulate people in tobacco control.
Right, Rebecca, you had a point on the same issue?
It was just to raise the point that conflict of interest is not just about industry funding, and people like Glantz have conflict of interest because the people that fund their work want them to continue doing that work. Scientific conflicts of interest exist.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Martin?
Hi, Martin Cullip, Taxpayers Protection Alliance. I'm just following in what Rebecca said. It's what I was going to say anyway, is one thing that hasn't been mentioned. We've talked about the regulators maybe over-regulating these products, but what about their advisors? There are hundreds of thousands of people all over the world who are employed to attack smoking and tobacco companies. And when these products come along, if someone can just walk into a vape shop and stop smoking by buying a vape with their own money, government and these regulators have got nothing to do. They're all out of a job. The smoking cessation market at the moment is $34 billion worldwide, and it's expected to increase to 53.9 billion when you take into account the new demand for nicotine cessation products. Isn't that a great driver of the poor government regulations that we're getting all over the world on this subject?
Yes. I think there's sort of a few nods around the room, comment rather than question. Any further questions?
Can I just come back on what Clive was saying? I think Clive's absolutely right. I think, and this is back to, the lived experience, the voice of the consumer, the fact that, you've got people, and we covered this in some of our earlier reports, the people who were sporty people during their teens, and then they took up smoking, and now they can hardly get up the stairs, and they switched to vaping, and their life is turned around. And there's thousands of examples like that. It's not a question, like you say, it's not a question of being addicted, because as soon as you use the word addiction in the public domain, people immediately think of the worst excesses of heroin and crack and crystal meth and all the rest of it. That's the public image, helped by media and films and all the rest of it, about what addiction is all about. And Ethan made the point, it's addiction is habit plus harm. You take the harm out and you've just got a habit, which isn't necessarily harmful. So it comes back to a bit what I was saying before. It's about how you get those messages out about why people enjoy nicotine, what they get from it. I think people understand this from smoking, because people. You've seen it on the films for years and years and years. People smoke when they're under stress, and they smoke after sex, some of them. And smoking has the nicotine delivers a range of different pleasures for people. And that may be part of the problem as well. Maybe regulators and public health people, syntax and all of that, they don't want to hear about the pleasures of nicotine. All they want to hear about is how addictive it is and awful it is, and it buggers up kids' brains and all all of that nonsense. But there's this hidden voice, this missing voice in all of this, and Rebecca picked up on that, with listening to her constituents. So we need to hear more of that kind of stuff. How you actually package that for regulators to counteract the sorts of arguments you hear from the anti-THR lobby. I'm not sure it'll be a big job, but not impossible.
Okay, any other comments from the...
Yeah, if I may, I want to add that one weak point, it's my opinion, of THR advocacy is saying that traditional tobacco control does not work at all. Because maybe it's already true for countries where smoking rates are already low, about 10% or below. However, we saw in past 3 or 4 decades that there were quite an impressive impact on smoking rates in these countries. At the same time, in low middle income countries, and I'm talking from my perspective, I am from Georgia. Georgia, for example, implement comprehensive tobacco control laws, so smoke-free policies, banning advertisement of tobacco combustibles only in 2017. And in Georgia, every second man is a smoker. And from this perspective, where tobacco control laws are not so strict compared to the Western countries, for example, and tax rates on combustibles are extremely low, I think in those countries, we still first need implementing traditional tobacco control plus investing in cessation services, which are not existent in these countries, and in parallel talk about tobacco harm reduction. Because, for example, as I showed you in my presentation, price points and price determinant is also important in case of substitution of smoking by S&Ps. In Georgia, for example, if you want to buy disposable, it's 5 times more expensive than pack of cigarettes. If you want to switch to heated tobacco products, you need to buy heating device, which according to official statistics, it's about 20% of household monthly income. So it's very high financial barrier there. And despite if even person believes that these products are safer, and this is also one of the main concerns in these countries, which are heavily financed by WHO and kind of international organization, they don't believe that first, these products are safer, and second, if even they are safer, this is quite niche product for the high income populations. So I think in regard of low middle income countries, we should not abort the idea at all of higher taxes on cigarettes, for example, and stricter tobacco control in terms of combustibles. But we need also in parallel push the idea of tobacco harm reduction.
Okay, I think at that point we should end. I can smell the food has arrived, and we have a slightly tight program today, and we've got the film premiere this afternoon, so be ready for that, and we'll be serving popcorn without diacetyl from 10 minutes before the performance. But it remains to me to thank Global Action, who fund our work, to thank all the KAC team who are spread out in many countries around the world. Thank all the KAC team for this report and all their other work, and to thank our 3 panelists today. Thank you.